Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Here we strive to tell the real stories of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in it. It's important to us to dispel the truth, myths, and mistakes and downright lies and so forth, uh, misunderstandings and everything else about of the war and its participants. I am Bill Dixon, your host, Vietnam veteran, 67, 68, TET survivor, and your host, as I said. We broadcast in the Raleigh, North Carolina studios of Nissan Communications. You should check out some of their other shows online when you go home. You're welcome, encouraged to participate with your host and or our guests with your comments or questions. Just call in or use Skype to be live and important part of the show. And you can see there on the screen, the telephone number is 919-518-9773, or better yet, go on to Skype, Computers 2K Voice, and be a voice on the air. Help us out, ask questions, make comments. If you, it's important to us that we tell the truth, and we do a lot of research trying to get everything ready for the show. And if there's something that myself, if we have a guest that you have a problem with, let me know. I'll call the show and say, hey, I believe you might be wrong there. And we'll do some research and tell you whether we're wrong and you're right or whatever. As you can see also there, there's the Veterans Crisis Line, 22 veterans a day. That's too many. None would be about right. But if you're a veteran or you know a veteran who's having a struggle, have them call this number and talk to these people. Some good people on the other line there. Tonight, our show is going to be on two different operations in Vietnam early on. Tonight, our show is Operation Chopper and Operation Ranch Hand. And we'll be going through the both of them. Now, Operation Chopper, you see that banana there? It's got a rotor in it and skids on it. One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is Operation Chopper, and that is the Flying Banana, a CH-21 Flying Banana, and that's was part of Ranch Hand. That really was not a banana, but it just looks like one, okay? We can show you, I think I can show you what one looks like. Just a second. Oops, no, we're not going to go into the story first. Back in January of 1962, Vietnam, Thursday, January 11th, in his State of the Union speech, President John F. Kennedy says, and I quote, "We support the independence of those newer or weaker states whose history, geography, economy, or lack of power impels them to remain outside entangling alliances, as we did ourselves for so many years. For the independence of nation is a bar to the communist grand design. It is the basis of our own. In the past year, for example, we have urged a neutral and independent Laos regain there a common policy with our major allies and insist that a ceasefire preceded negotiations, while a workable formula for supervising its independence is still to be achieved. Both the spread of war and a communist occupation thus far has been prevented. A satisfactory settlement in Laos would also help to achieve and safeguard the peace in Vietnam, where the foe is increasingly his tactics of terror, where efforts have been stepped up, and where the local government has initiated new programs and reforms to broaden the base of resistance." Okay. The systematic aggression now bleeding that country is not a war of liberation, for Vietnam is already free. It is a war of attempted subjugation, and it will be resisted. From JFK's 11th of January State of the Union address. Now, on Friday, January 12th, the next day, Operation Chopper takes off. And then the next day after that, January 13th, Operation Ranch Hand takes off. Then on Monday, January 15th, from a news conference held by President Kennedy, the question was, "Mr. President, are American troops now in combat in Vietnam?" And his answer was no. And technically, he was right, because no U.S. soldier was serving in combat. They were combat advisors, which means they didn't get which still means they got shot at and maybe even had to shoot back. But I'm not even certain they were allowed to do that. But they were advisors with the South Vietnamese Army and Marines and Navy and so forth, with U.S. pilots flying missions for the South Vietnamese Air Force. But technically, they're saying that we were not in combat at that time, even though we were losing soldiers. Until the fall, that means the time of year, not the fall of Saigon, but the fall of 1961, the Republic of Vietnam, RVN, had only a very limited capacity or capability for airborne operations, one helicopter squadron and two transport squadrons, and no training in the technical of air mobile operations, which would be hard to train in because in air mobile operations, because there were no books back then on air mobile operations. But as you can see there from one of the Kennedy's quotes, now we have a problem in making our power credible, and Vietnam is the place. So in order to make the United States power credible, we went into Vietnam. In November of 1961, in line with President Kennedy's decision to prevent communist domination of Vietnam, which goes back to what we were talking about before sometime, the domino theory, the U.S. Army assumed the mission of helping South Vietnamese armed forces increase their airlift and air mobility capabilities. Even though officially North Vietnam was not attacking the South, but they were backing the Viet Minh, or as we call them, the Vietnamese Communists, the VC. But officially, they were not. They were not in combat with us either at that time. We'll say. Okay. At that time, under existing national policy, the Army at first could neither deploy armed helicopter units to Vietnam nor overtly participate in counterinsurgency operations. Now, I want to read that again. We could not send or could not use armed helicopters. Okay, that was policy and procedures. Training Vietnamese in helicopter operations and tactics, though considered at one time, would have been too complicated and time-consuming at the time. During November of 1961, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the deployment of three transportation companies, light helicopters. They were not exactly called helicopter squadrons. They were transportation companies equipped with CH-21s to the Republic of Vietnam. Now, I already showed you the picture of the banana. That was the CH-21. By January, companies had arrived, and by 15th of April had been augmented by Marine helicopter squadron. In other words, once they opened the door and started to send helicopter stuff in, they kept right on sending helicopters and men, and they even sent the Marines some helicopters, okay? Now, that up there, the top picture is a flying banana. If it was orange or yellow, it would look like a banana. The reason it was a banana is because it had two big set of props, and so it wouldn't hit each other. They was one higher than the other. Their mission was to expedite combat operations, providing direct technical and logistic air transport to South Vietnamese combat units. In other words, to fly support missions for the ARVN Armed Forces, since Vietnamese pilots were not yet qualified, and to assist in training activities. So when they first sent the helicopters in, as you remember a while ago, they're not armed. And the helicopter units were followed in February by the first fixed-wing aircraft, and I believe that's called a Skyhawk there on the bottom where the wings fold up. Okay. But in November, when they first started to thinking about sending helicopters, what they did was in November 1961, the 57th Transportation Company from Fort Lewis, Washington, and the 8th Transportation Company from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, spent rough days at sea aboard the Core. Now, that's the Core, as it sailed from San Francisco with its cargo of 400 U.S. advisors or aviators and their support staff, with 33 CH-21s nicknamed the Flying Banana because of a distinctive bent hull that prevented the helicopter twin rotors from colliding. Okay. Now, there's your good picture of the banana. In December 1961, the USNS Core arrived in Vietnam and steamed up the Mekong River towards Saigon. The ship was a refitted World War II baby flat top. It wasn't a full size. Carried its cargo of 400 U.S. Army aviators and its support personnel, along with the 33 Flying Bananas. Okay. U.S. forces launched Operation Chopper January 12, 1962, marking the U.S. military's first combat operations in Vietnam. This small campaign was the birth of major helicopter-borne attacks that have become the defining image of the Vietnam War. Operation Chopper was part of Operation Ranch Hand, but you can see the Vietnamese who are getting on the chopper was the first mission, which we'll be talking about in just a moment. The newly arrived American helicopters and crews soon participated in a combat operation, Operation Chopper, that one American enlisted man remembered 50 years later as almost boring. What they did was, I think we talk about it on the next slide, so let me go to that one. Operation Chopper, as all the Vietnamese are getting on the helicopters. Operation Chopper, the first helicopter battle of the Vietnam War, was the insertion of 1,000 ARVN, or South Vietnamese soldiers, or paratroopers, into a suspected Viet Cong complex 10 miles west of Saigon by American pilots and crew flying the unarmed CH-23 Flying Bananas. In other words, the Americans were jobbed with delivering the South Vietnamese forces to the battle location, which goes back on into later the air cav and so forth, the American soldiers, which we'll talk about. The Viet Cong were completely stunned by this quick airborne attack. They had not seen helicopters flying with loaded like that before. And after a short battle, they retreated into the surroundings. You can see the picture there of the ARVNs getting off, and then the picture of the ARVN or the Viet Cong are running away. After a short battle, they were surprised so much that they just kind of disappeared into the jungles and surrounding areas. Since the 1950s, now, if you look at the Vietnam Wall, it says, 59, I believe it is, but since the 1950s in the Harry Truman administration, the American advisors had kept a low profile in Vietnam. With the 400 men on the USNS Core began a fast-growing buildup from 1,000 Americans in the beginning of 1961 to 3,200 by the end of 1961. And that's the American soldiers teaching the Vietnamese the rules of combat and how to do so forth, okay? Now, I didn't know this until I started doing the research. Look up at the top. There was a World War II helicopter. I thought they just came around in Korea, but that's a picture of a World War II helicopter. During the Vietnam War, it was called America's first helicopter war. But as you can see there was helicopters in World War II. Air mobility as a military tactic was not used for the first time in Vietnam. Its early beginnings were in World War II with the use of paratroopers as an air mobility tactic. That's when the paratroopers jumped out of airplanes and landed behind the enemy lines and so forth. But the bottom picture of Korea reminds me of MASH every time I look at it, the TV series and the movie. With its weather extremes, difficult terrains, and large number of communist troops, the Korean War led to further use of the helicopter for supply and medical transportation. In 1952, the American Army formed 12 helicopter battalions. There they are at the 38th parallel in Korea. In the war in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Communist forces very quickly realized that the American use of the helicopter had changed the overall dynamics of the war, along with America's increased involvement in the war. From a communist pamphlet printed for their troops and obtained in 1962, they acknowledged the South Vietnamese advantage with the new helicopter in their operations. But every time they would always come back along and adjust. And then we would make a change and they would adjust. If you remember, if you ever saw the movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, he talks about the North Vietnamese officer talks about getting inside and holding them by the belt, because the closer they were to the Americans, less likely they could come in and shoot. Now, we're talking about the terrain of Vietnam. As you can see there, the dense jungles, it was hard to get the helicopter to land in there because the jungles were so thick. And then you had the mountains. It's hard to get the helicopter in sometimes in the mountains. And of course, down in the delta, you can see the guys wading through the swamps and so forth. So even though Vietnam was tropical and didn't have quite the weather of Korea and so forth, it was still very hard to get in. The Pamphlets also took note of the disadvantage of deploying forces by helicopter in the forested and jungle-covered areas and the vulnerability of the helicopter to communist fire while deploying or picking up troops. What it's saying there is when the helicopter's coming in, hovering down real slow, it's just like a nice target there. The pamphlet went on to encourage the shooting of helicopters. In other words, if they were telling all the communists when the helicopter's coming in, it's going to slow down for a little bit while it unloads the troops. And that's the time, if you've got anything you got, you start shooting at the helicopter. When the helicopter first arrived in Vietnam, there was no standard operating procedure for combat assaults because in Korea, it was mostly used for supply and medical care. So now we've got the helicopters with troops in it. They're coming in, and in order to develop procedures, a lot of men died, a lot of trial and error. The tactics of the helicopter operations were developed in combat. In other words, they were out there doing it and developed the tactics and so forth that was doing it. And there wasn't somebody sitting back in an office and going, let me figure this out, and then we'll send y'all out. They sent them out and they figured out. That's typical OJ on the job training. As tactics were developed, the communists would often develop counter tactics requiring constant tweaking of the helicopter tactics. As you can see there, the helicopter was shot down. The communists were quick learners of the tactics used by the helicopters. The unarmed CH-21 Flying Banana left a lot to be desired as a combat assault weapon. They flew kind of like they looked, slow and slow. They were slow and big and cumbersome and unarmed in the beginning. Now, later they did arm them. Within 6 months, the 8th Transportation Company suffered its first losses of Joseph Goldberg, Harold Guthrie, and James Lane. They were killed when their helicopter hit by small arms fire and crashed. And that is the Viet Cong shooting at a helicopter with the AK-47s there. Okay. With a little more than a month after 540 combat support sorties. Now, that's what that's saying is within a month after they got there, they flew 540 operations with the helicopter. It appeared that U.S. efforts were off to a good start. A quick strike capability, which had been lacking, could now be provided, but it appeared that because the large area to be covered, the number of helicopter companies was inadequate. Vietnam is a long, narrow country, and between the jungles and the mountains and the swamps, it's amazing how the terrain and temperatures and everything else changed. The estimate monthly requirement was 820 sorties a month. That was in 62. Since the CH-21 helicopter was outdated, there was a need for more modern equipment, series of helicopters. But early in 1962, the United States didn't have the equipment. They kind of adopted the helicopter, they adopted the tactics for the helicopter. They started to changing the designs and concepts of the helicopter fit the tactics and situations. So as long as the tactics were growing and the helicopter itself was changing. Developed in the late 50s, the Flying Banana was a single-engine, twin-rotor machine with a modest payload capacity. It was underpowered, slow, and required a lot of maintenance in Vietnam's tropical environment. See, folks, during the dry season, you could take a mayonnaise jar, empty, and set it out someplace that would fill up with dirt. Because that was, I don't care what it was, everything was covered in dirt. And of course, during the monsoon seasons, everything got wet. The Flying Banana continued being used in Vietnam until 1964. They were replaced by a turbine engine and more powerful helicopters, such as the Bell UH-1 Huey, the Chinook, and the Cobra, which you see there, which is what most people recognize as part of the Vietnam War. The Chinook, as you can see, carried a lot of troops, but it was also good for moving airplanes around or picking up helicopters were shot down, moving artillery out to the base camps. it was basically a workman's thing where the others were, huh? Yeah, the real workhorse there, and which means they were also nice targets because but they had the twin rotors too, but they don't like a banana. The type of operations the U.S. Army helicopter companies initially varied due to difference in terrain, as we've talked about, weather, and a type of military mission. If you look up at the top picture there, you can see I Corps, which goes up into the DMZ. That's the northernmost part of South Vietnam. A little more hilly there, mountains and so forth. And then you've got what it says I Corps, in northern I Corps area, the helicopter company was engaged chiefly in a small scale resupply of numerous outposts. All over the area of I Corps, the little base camps, special forces camps, and so forth. In central Vietnam, 2 Corps, which you see there where the word South Vietnam is kind of in that area, resupply missions far outnumber the few air mobile operations that were undertaken. And then we go down to 3 Corps, which is where Saigon, you can see it. Okay. This is an outline of 3 Corps. This is where Saigon is located, Long Binh, Bien Hoa, Air Base, and so forth. That's where the vast majority of people live. In 3 Corps, the large Delta area were helicopters extensively employed in combined air mobile operations with troop lifts ranging from company to battalion sizes. The results were rather meager. More often than not, the ARVN units failed to trap the Viet Cong. They merely captured or destroyed weapons, material, and installations. See, part of the problem was that how did you tell the good guys and the bad guys? Sometimes the South Vietnamese soldiers couldn't tell the good guys and the bad guys. So along with their regular South Vietnamese soldiers, there were guys in there who would tell the Viet Cong that they were coming. So even though they were coming in on the helicopter as a surprise attack, quite often the Viet Cong knew they were coming and just disappeared. Although more than 100 ARVN companies were trained in air mobile operations, the responses were often sluggish, and almost always intelligence proved to be faulty. In other words, they would say there's a battalion of VC out there. When they get there was nobody there. So we don't know if they were never there or when they were coming in, they knew they were coming in advance and they disappeared. But anyway, the ARVNs were out there, but they were not doing the job that needed to be done. Not necessarily from their part, but the way it was working. See, back then, there was still all Americans were advisors. The need for more helicopter companies was filled by September of 1962 when 2 additional companies arrived in the Republic of Vietnam, raising a total of 6 companies, including the Marine Squadron. By then, it had become apparent that the CH-21, Flying Banana, transports had to be protected against enemy action. You got to remember, they were up at that time, they were still unarmed. The Army concluded that armed escort helicopters could provide the protection and do better than fixed-wing aircraft. So the airplanes would have to come in, and they'd have to come in and shoot up the area and strafe the area and leave because they can't just hang there like a helicopter did. So they got the idea, well, let's send in some helicopters with the troop transport, and they're standing there, standing by, shoot up the area, and then they're standing by, so if there's a lot of contact, they can come in and help the infantry and so forth. So that was, again, another tactic that started growing. That's a Huey with guns and rockets on the side there. Okay. By early October, an Army Utility Technical Transport Company equipped with UH-1 armed helicopters arrived in Saigon. So in 1962, late in October, they finally started getting some the real helicopters in. The UH-1As were replaced by faster and more powerful UH-1Bs as soon as the Cuban crisis had passed. In other words, all the good helicopters were kept to find out what the Russians and the Cubans were going to do. And after that was resolved, then they were able to send the better helicopters to Vietnam. It's amazing how one thing affects the other, isn't it? By January 1963, 222 U.S. Army aircraft were in Vietnam, for a total of 149 of them were helicopters. They had flown 57,197 sorties and had transported 4,750 tons of cargo and 251,938 passengers in 47,600 fly hours. That's a lot of use early on. I mean, we're still talking about in 63. We only been there a year, so a little over a year there. Okay. These operations provided the first hard test for air mobile doctrine under combat conditions. In other words, let's just go in there and land and we'll test it out for a while. No, the Viet Cong were there and they were doing whatever they could do to make it get that learning curve a little faster there. Concept and tactics had been developed as early as 1956. The doctrine was that forces transportation via helicopter operating beyond the range of friendly ground fire support needed to be armed to accomplish their mission. If you remember a while ago, the unarmed flying bananas were just going in and dumping out their people and leaving. But as the helicopter developed and they were bringing more and more people, helicopters in, they realized, as we've already said, that we got to have some gunships to go along with those helicopters. Since the helicopter proven to be most vulnerable during landing and takeoffs, they required a defensive fire capability and means to level suppressor fires against enemy action, which is what we just were talking about. Okay? There's a door gunner in the helicopter, and he's laying down fire with his machine gun there. The Army doctrine stressed the importance of speed, surprise, and firepower in helicopter combat operations. That was a part of the whole process of the helicopter, to get in, get the troops unloaded, and make it safe for them to get in. In a typical air mobile operation, the assault forces was to approach its objective along pre-planned routes. Now, we did everything by pre-planned routes. Avoiding enemy concentrations of anti-aircraft weapons not destroyed in pre-strike missions. In other words, they would try to go in and kind of get an area kind of prepped up before they were sending in. In air mobile operations in Vietnam, the helicopters had to take additional protective measures. Deception is to approach routes to target protection of crews and aircraft, self-sealing fuel tanks. They developed those in other words, once a bullet hit the fuel tank, rather than the fuel running out, they had self-sealing. I imagine it was an interesting time before they come up with that one. Body armor, and some armor around the vital parts. There are a couple places in the helicopter that one bullet could bring it down, and other places that bullet wouldn't make any difference unless it hit something, a person or so forth. And body armor, as you remember in the last show, Jack Heslin talked about the chicken plates and sitting on things that caused the bullets were coming from the ground. Vital aircraft parts, armored, door-mounted weapons, armed escort helicopters, neutralize enemy forces, and rescue procedures for disabled aircraft. As soon as a helicopter or an airplane went down, there was a call went out for whatever it took to come in and get it and so forth. After 1 year operations, it was found that to avoid gunfire, formations should fly at 1,500 to 2,000 feet instead of close to the ground. Contour flying was practiced in the jungle of the Highlands region. Transports also needed 5 to 7 escorts instead of 3. In other words, when a helicopter went in, they needed, instead of the 3 originally thought of, they needed 5 to 7. Now, what they're talking about as far as contour flying, you fly real low to the ground, you're flying over trees, and then you go out in an open spot, you drop down. So that helicopter is going up, and down, which is kind of like riding a fair ride at the fair if you're in the helicopter. So you either had to fly high so they couldn't shoot at you, but if you sneak up on them sometimes, you're flying low, they wouldn't see you until you're almost gone. So you can see them flying there over Papasan on his sampan. Troop-carrying helicopter formations were to be escorted by armed, high-performance helicopters, which provide the needed suppression fires en route and in objective area. To reduce chances of being detected, contour flying was to be used. Air Force was to provide additional air cover if needed. And there's the Air Force there. You call in what we call the fast movers to come in and either help prep, or if the groups were already on the ground and they were getting a lot of fire, they would come in and drop their bombs and napalm or whatever to give the guys because you realize those guys on the helicopter got to land, they got to get off the helicopter and find cover. The Army concluded that the helicopter could be operated in a combat environment if suppressive fire were provided. I can't imagine that it took too long to come up with that idea. That if people are shooting at you, you might want to do something to kind of slow them down, but it is the military. Not until February 1963, the restrictive rules of engagement were eased to the extent that armed helicopters could engage clearly identified enemy targets that posed a threat to the safety of helicopters and passengers. Let me read that again. We sent the helicopters in 62. Not until February 63 that restrictive rules of engagement were eased to the extent that armed helicopters could engage clearly identified targets that posed a threat to the safety of helicopters and their passengers in flights close to but not across the Laotian and Cambodian borders. Before, we couldn't get close to the Cambodian and Laotian borders, but you can fly along the borders now. Tactical and technical improvements were achieved in the areas of reconnaissance, configuration of flight formations, approaching landing zones, and armed escort procedures, command and control weapons and equipment. Now, when they sent in the troops on the ground, they usually had the officer in charge up flying a helicopter above who was watching things because he could see things that up in the air that you couldn't see on the ground. Because if you're in the middle of a thick jungle or whatever, you can't see that there's 500 bad guys right across the ditch from you. But his job as a command and control up there, he can see it and so forth. And what they also found that quite often they would send a helicopter in and it would land in a couple of different places, and as opposed to just coming in and unloading the troops, they may land in 2 or 3 places. So if you land in a place that you're not going to unload the troops, the communists would send people there. In the meantime, you go to where you're really going. So they kind of tried to fool the communists that way, and all kinds of booby traps and so forth they come up with. As the size and frequency of Viet Cong attacks increased during the 1964, the Republic of Vietnam Army became increasingly dependent on tactical air and helicopter support for mobility firepower, and logistics support. In other words, why should we get out there and walk through the jungle? We can get the helicopter and ride. From 1962 to 1973, 2,105 helicopter pilots were killed. 76 reported missing in action. That's a lot of pilots. During the war, according to the Department of Defense, 2,588 helicopters were lost in hostile action, with another 2,282 lost due to operational complications. You got to remember, the weather had a lot to do with it. During the dry season, the monsoons, the heat, the humidity, all that, plus all the use. I mean, look how many hours we talked about a while ago, the helicopters on the ground. Sometimes it didn't get the maintenance that needed to be done. The Commander General of MACV, that's the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, the American guys, stated that without U.S. Army and Air Force support, the Republic of Vietnam Army's position would have become untenable. Without U.S. support, he judged, required an increase in the effectiveness of both fighter planes and armed helicopters under the new existing rules of engagement. Now we can shoot back. As in 1962 and 1963, the helicopter, with its agility and capability, operation in marginal weather, proved to be complementary to the ground fighter. The armed helicopters also proved effective in primary role escorting and protecting transports. In other words, if you had a convoy going down the road, the helicopters could fly over and give them protection. If you had the boats on the river, the helicopters could fly and give them some protection. It became very versatile as a tool to not only deliver troops, but to get materials and so forth, because a troop of armed fighters are not any good without food, water, ammunition, and medical care. So the helicopter did all those things. Armed helicopters did not exclusively support airborne landing operations in a typical assault. Republic of Vietnam and U.S. fixed-wing aircraft delivered a heavy preparatory strike Then armed helicopters followed with suppressive fire to neutralize any positions that might have escaped the first strike. But it's amazing. The Viet Cong come up with ideas. They would build themselves bunkers. So the planes come along first and drop their bombs or whatever, and they hide in those bunkers. And as soon as the planes would go, they jump back out and ready to start shooting again. So then we'd send the helicopters in, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes when those guys were trying to get off the helicopter, there was a lot of fire as they were coming in. There was a hot LZ, as we called it. Suppressive fire continued until the troop landing was completed and the transports had left. On occasion, the armed helicopters remained to help the landed forces. Night operations. This was a new thing. Night operations came into Oman in 1964. An important reason for this was the increase in Viet Cong nighttime actions. The Viet Cong used to say, "We own the night." The first U.S. experiment in night operations took place in October of 1963 when 80 Republic of Vietnam Army men were landed under cover of darkness. In this instance, the lead helicopter guided the formation to the landing zone by using its lights. They had some bright lights. But guys, you got to think about it. When that light's shining, everybody knows where they are. What good is the nighttime? Because you got this headlight there going, "I'm here, shoot at me." The following aircraft then did the same. In other words, the first helicopter in had its light on, and as he flew out, the next helicopter coming in had his light on because they had to be able to see, which means when they could see, the bad guys could see. That wasn't exactly ideal if you think about it. Um, in June 1964, in another trial, 70 Vietnamese were landed just after dark without landing lights. For lack of communications, all but the first ship had difficulty locating the landing zone. It's dark. There are no street lights. It yeah, I knew I could say that word. Proved necessary to use flares to illuminate the sky. And you can see one of the flares going off. In subsequent operations, flares were used quite generally. But when the flare is flaring, it is bright. It does a strange thing to your night vision. But flares had a way of interfering with operations because they tended to blind the pilots. So let's see, you're flying with the headlight and they can see you. You're flying with flares, they don't last very long. So we're gonna fly in now with the flares and so forth. And you can see there it turns night into daytime. So if you had any night vision at all, you lost it coming in. So it's brighter, but you can't see any much better. To overcome these problems, studies were undertaken that considered, among other things, instrument training and navigational aids for helicopter pilots. Only 5% of the pilots had such training, and pathfinders. Training was impractical. Pathfinders would have a compromised surprise. And at the close of 1964, no solution had been found. Success in night operations may be described as modest. Now, later, they were developing later the night vision goggles, which helped a little bit. So, again, we had a very steep learning curve. We lost a lot of people in helicopters during that learning period. And looking back, after 3.5 years of U.S. Army-supported air mobile operations in Vietnam, one may conclude that such operations, the environment of Vietnam, had been a qualified success. Limiting factors, however, are the terrain, weather, and special conditions under which the U.S. propels. As you can see there, the rice paddies. It's kind of hard to land a helicopter in the rice paddies. You just kind of hover there. As you can see on the right bottom picture, when in Vietnam, it rained. I mean, it rained. And then, of course, back to the jungles and so forth. You can see that helicopter coming down in the jungle. Quite often, they would go out there with dynamite or C4 and blow just big enough for the helicopter to get in. I believe when Jack on the last show talked about he had his door gunner looking out the back and he looked out the front, and the helicopter blade just kind of trimmed the trees and bushes as a landing. I'm not certain if you would call that takes a lot of guts or just kind of crazy. Yeah. Foremost among special limiting conditions is the fact that U.S. forces operated in an advisory and supporting role where persuasion replaces the control. See, we couldn't tell the Vietnamese commander what to do or how to do it. You had an ego problem there. You may have an American officer But you also may have an American sergeant who's trying to tell a South Vietnamese soldier or officer, you need to do this, you need to do that. And he's got people back in Saigon says now, you got to be careful because we don't want you to lose too many men and so forth. But we want you to have a good body count and do good, but don't lose too many men because it looks bad. So you had the American forces trying to get things done and trying to teach the South Vietnamese soldiers, and quite often the commanders didn't want their soldiers trained for whatever reason because they wanted to make sure they had complete control. So, as American advisors, you had a lot of conflicts back and forth to get anything done. You had to be a real politician to get anything done. The political strategies, escalation of the conflict, on the other hand, had its tendencies to increase U.S. influence, if only because without it, the downfall of the Republic of Vietnam would only be a matter of time, which is one of the reasons we started picking up and having doing combat ourselves. And this is about the time that we kind of go on. Well, advisors are good, but it ain't getting the job done the way we need to be. So we're going to send our combat soldiers in there. Okay? As of the end of 1964, information compiled by MACV, that's Military Assistance Command Vietnam, monthly command evaluation reports that indicated that the frequency of air mobile operations of all categories increased at an average of about 60 per week throughout Vietnam. This was reflected further by statistics on Army aviation operations, which showed a total of 427,120 sorties flown in the year 64. 427,120 sorties. Somebody was putting some time in. An average of 8,213 per week. Of these, 333,397 were combat support missions, weekly average of 6,411, which carried a total of 576,682 passengers, most of whom were troops, for an average weekly lift of 11,090 personnel. I think the helicopter had definitely come into its own by 1964. The number of rotary wing aircraft hit by hostile fire was 740, of which 69 were shot down or lost to hostile fire. As you can see there, the front canopy where the pilot was supposed to sit is all shot out and so forth. This demonstrated an average loss of all types of Army aviation craft to less than 5 per month. Now, 5 per month is not bad unless you're one of the 5. But with all the going on and so forth, 5 per month is you saw how many hours they were spending. It's not too bad. That only one sortie in each 426 flown were hit by hostile fire. That definitely changed as the war went on, and that was back in '64. So went on. The cumulative total of Army craft shot down or lost from hostile fire from January 1, 1963 to December 31st, 1964 was 126 of all types. That was airplanes and helicopters. It represented a negligible percentage of rate in comparison to total sorties flown. It was a negligible rate unless you were one of the guys that got shot down. Of course, some guys got shot down multiple times. Getting shot down wasn't so bad depending on where you were and you didn't get shot up. The largest single air mobile lift in 1964 had been the movement of 1,300 man force of Vietnamese Marines in a pre-planned operation involving more than 40 U.S. helicopters in addition to other transport aircraft. That was a big operation then. Developed in Vietnam, air mobility was the greatest advance in conventional combat power since the introduction of tanks and mechanized forces in World War I. And it forced structural changes in tactical doctrine that continue to this day. All the aspects of using helicopters in combat was pretty much developed in Vietnam, had to be constantly tweaked as the enemy and so forth adjusted. You can see some of the different helicopters there. You see the Huey we use for Medicap. You see the one delivering troops. You see the Chinook. You see the little helicopter there. It was they could load that thing with guns and so forth. I forgot what that was called. That helicopter. It just slipped my mind what it was, but it was awesome. The White House expected that some type of incident would occur. This is how we got in going here. The White House expected some type of incident would occur eventually, and it prepared the text of a congressional resolution authorizing the president to use armed forces to protect U.S. forces and deter further aggression from North Vietnam. Now, let me read that again. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was prepared in advance on August 7th, 1964. Up until then, we've been pretty much advisors. Johnson secured almost unanimous consent from Congress, 414-0 in the House, 88-2 in the Senate, for his Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which became the principal legislative basis for all subsequent military deployment in Southeast Asia. And for those of you who out there have been hiding someplace, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was by a non-event. On 2nd of August, there was some shooting involved, but the August 7th, August 4th, when they claimed they were being under attack, there was no such attack at all. So, but I don't think the guys on the ship, because they were working by radar, and it's thought there might have been a flight of geese flying over where they thought it was missiles. But Admiral Stockdale, who was not an admiral at the time, was flying over in his airplane going, what are those American ships shooting at? Because he couldn't see anything. With this new escalation of war, the United States took on a more aggressive tactic in becoming combat ready rather than the South Vietnamese advisors. The Joint Chiefs of Staff endorsed Westmoreland's request for 150,000 U.S. troops to take the ground offense in South Vietnam. Now, here's another interesting part. When McNamara concurred, Johnson decided to commit the forces. In other words, McNamara was running the war, and he said that, I think we support Westmoreland's idea. So Johnson said, okay, we'll send in 150. The buildup of formal U.S. military units had begun on 8th of March, 1965, when 2 battalions of Marines landed at Da Nang. They actually landed at Red Beach in Da Nang, and they did their typical combat landing. The only problem was the only people on the shore were high school students, as you see the young girl there, welcoming the Marines to Vietnam, putting leis around their head, holding up signs going, thank you for coming to support our country. But they were landed like they were landing at Iwo Jima there. In June, Marines and Army units began offensive units Operation Search and Destroy one. When then they had to later change those names because politically correct, they didn't want to use the word search and destroy. The idea was you search for the enemy and you destroy them. On 28th of July, Johnson announced that 50,000 more U.S. troops would go to South Vietnam immediately. By the end of the year, the 184,300 U.S. personnel in South Vietnam. Now, it had been in 62, there was a little over 1,000 there. That's a lot of troops coming in really quick. When the escalation of the air and ground war in 1965, Hanoi began deploying to the south increasing units of regular North Vietnamese Army, or People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, as it was called. In October, General Giap, the PAVN commander, launched a major offensive in the Central Highlands southwest of, I think that's supposed to be Pleiku, but I don't know where that whatever that, I don't know what that is, but I think it's southwest of Pleiku. Westmoreland responded with the 1st Air Cav Division Air Mobile. Through much of November, in the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, U.S. and North Vietnamese forces engaged each other in heavy combat for the first time. The first big battle was 8th of November, Operation Hump by the 173rd Airborne. If you've ever heard the song, country western song, the 8th of November by Big and Rich, it tells the story of Miles Harris, who was a radio operator, and also Lawrence Joel. Lawrence Joel from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, was the first Black American to win the Medal of, first live Black American to win the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. But what most people know about from the movie and so forth was the Ia Drang Valley, which was the movie We Were Soldiers Once about Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, which kind of brought in the first use of Americans in the 1st Cav Division and so forth. And the group that landed at Adrang Valley was the 7th Cav, just like General Custer's 7th Cav, part of the first Cav division. And they were coming in, and they landed them right at the bottom of the mountain that was surrounded and completely covered by battalions of North Vietnamese communists. In 1965, the United States had crossed the line from advising armies to actually fighting the war against the Viet Cong. The president downplayed the move. You got to remember, see that in the book? It wasn't the Vietnam War. It was America's conflict. Okay? We were not, I was not in a war. I was in a conflict. The Joint Chiefs of Staff warned the mobilization of the reserves and National Guard. And McNamara proposed levying a war tax. In other words, they weren't going to get serious about this war thing. Such actions would have put the United States on a war footing. But there's a little more finagling going on. President Johnson, with his ambitious social reform programs, facing crucial votes in Congress, he wanted to avoid giving congressional conservatives an opportunity to use mobilization to block his domestic agendas. He had lots of programs, affirmative action programs, and so forth. And he was afraid that if he went to Congress to declare war, that they were going to say, well, we need the money for the war. So they never bothered to declare war officially. He just used his own powers. Consequently, he relied on other means. And so the war, the Vietnam War wasn't a war, it was a conflict because he wanted his New Deal and that sort of stuff to go. Monthly draft calls increased from 17,000 to 35,000 to manpower needs and deficit spending with its inherent inflationary impact. Can you imagine that? We did deficit spending back during the Vietnam War. As the Vietnam conflict went on, so did the use, scope, and action of types of helicopters, and number of helicopters grew along with skill and tactics of their crews. There were 24 different types of helicopters used and deployed in Vietnam. As they learned new tactics and they kept improving the helicopters, and under combat conditions and so found that some helicopters would be configured one way to do one thing, another helicopter needed to be another way. So there was 24 different types of helicopters used during the war. Now that gives you an idea of what the Operation Chopper was. Along with Operation Chopper was kind of how we got going into Vietnam to start with and so forth. And I'm looking at the clock. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of wait on operate. I don't want to start Operation Ranch Hand with the time we got because I wanted to give it all its due and so forth. But if you remember, the Operation Ranch Hand started the day after Operation Chopper. So as I'm going to take Operation Ranch Hand, and we're going to talk about that the next show. Operation Ranch Hand was as ominous in its outcome and its history today as Operation Chopper was, even more. Operation Ranch Hand was the spraying of defoliants in Vietnam. And I'm going to leave it at that part, but I'm going to take that over to our next show, which I'll add some more to it. But I hope you found the Operation Helicopter and development of helicopters. Like I said, the tactics of helicopters and so forth, the pilots and the crews had a tough learning curve. I can't imagine the things they went through because when they got a tactic and started using it a lot, then the communists would switch over and counter that tactic in a way they could. So I want to thank all of you out there. Our viewership is steady growing, and I thank all of you out there for your loyalty and watching the show. We hope to continue bringing you interesting stories as well as the truth. Our next show, as we said, will be Operation Ranch Hand. If you want to see this show or any other show that we've already done, please go to www.nissancommunications.com/live. Go to On Demand, and then go to Lessons of Vietnam and pick out one of your shows. And we had a guy call in not too long ago to talk to Amanon, complaining because he had to go to work and he was too interested in watching some of the old shows and was going to be late for work. I mean, he blamed us being late for work of him going out there. But one excuse is good enough. I can tell you, if you ever get sick and you want to stay out and watch a show, tell your boss you have diarrhea. They never check. Okay. So our next show will be 12th of September, and go out and do some research, and anything you see on the show, go out and do a little bit of reading on your own. Don't always take my word for it, even though I do spend a great deal of time researching and so forth. But talk to other veterans out there, do the research yourself. But we strive to give you the real story from the Vietnam veteran's point of view as well, what happened. As we already talked about, so many things get changed. Doing the research for this, I finally found out why we were not in a war, why we were in a conflict, because it was interfering with President Johnson's new social things that he had going on and so forth, and how the helicopter grew and so forth, and why so many different helicopters. So again, watch some of other shows. Come on and watch some of Amnon's other shows he does. How many shows you do now? 8 different shows. And I can tell you some of them have got some rather interesting subjects out there, from let's see, space travel to Vietnam to computer software. He's the computer software and computer people's expert. We'll see in his shows. But tune in to the show. Tell all your friends about us. If you are happy with the show, tell your friends. If you're not happy with the show, send me an email or give me a call. You saw the numbers up front, and tell me, and I'll see if I can't do whatever we need to do. Again, have a good remainder of the week, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the 12th of September. Good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.